Rebecca Torres had worked 17 Christmas Eves in the ICU at St. Catherine's Hospital in Boston. 17 times she'd walked past decorated trees in the lobby, past families hurrying home with last-minute gifts, past carolers singing in the parking lot. And 17 times she'd felt absolutely nothing. It wasn't always this way. Rebecca grew up in a devout Catholic home in Puerto Rico. Her grandmother's house had a small altar with candles always burning, images of saints on every wall, and a beautiful statue of the Virgin Mary in the living room. Rebecca remembered kneeling there as a child, whispering prayers, believing with absolute certainty that someone was listening. But that was before nursing school. Before she learned about science, evidence, the measurable world. Before she saw enough suffering to make her wonder how any benevolent God could allow it. The transition wasn't dramatic. There was no moment of crisis, no angry rejection of faith. It just faded, like a photograph left too long in the sun, until one day Rebecca realized she didn't believe anymore. She still respected those who did. Her mother still called every Sunday asking if she'd been to Mass. But for Rebecca, it was over. This Christmas Eve, 2024, was supposed to be like all the others. Rebecca arrived at 10:30 p.m. for her shift. The ICU had been decorated by the day nurses, small wreaths on the walls, gentle white lights around the nursing station, a miniature tree in the corner. Rebecca changed into her scrubs, tied her dark hair back, and checked her assignment. 8 patients tonight, beds 1 through 8. She reviewed each chart methodically. Bed 5 caught her attention. Maria Delgado, 81 years old, admitted 3 days ago with severe respiratory failure, advanced pneumonia, complicated by heart disease. The prognosis wasn't good. Rebecca had cared for Maria the previous 2 nights. The elderly woman had been unconscious since admission, her breathing supported entirely by the ventilator. Her family visited during the day. Rebecca had seen them in the handover notes. A daughter, 2 grandchildren, a great-grandson. They'd been told to prepare themselves. Rebecca started her rounds at 11 p.m. The hospital was unusually quiet tonight. Most of the staff had families to get home to, so the skeleton crew moved through their duties with practiced efficiency. She checked each patient, adjusting medications, monitoring vitals, making notes. When she reached bed 5, she paused. Maria looked smaller somehow, more fragile than she had the night before. Her weathered hands rested on the white sheets, a simple silver cross tangled in her fingers. Someone from the family must have placed it there. Rebecca checked the monitors. Oxygen saturation low but stable. Heart rate irregular but expected. Blood pressure maintained with medication. Everything was as it should be, which in the ICU often meant everything was precarious. Rebecca adjusted Maria's blanket and moved on. It was going to be a long night. Outside the windows, snow had begun to fall over Boston. Christmas morning was 4 hours away, and in the ICU, that meant nothing at all. Here, time was measured in heartbeats and breath cycles, not holidays. Rebecca returned to the nursing station and began updating charts. Midnight came and went. 1 a.m. The only sounds were the mechanical hum of ventilators, the soft beeping of monitors, and the occasional shuffle of footsteps in distant hallways. At 2:30 a.m., Rebecca made another round. Everything remained stable. She returned to her station, made herself coffee from the small pot they kept running, and settled in for the quietest part of the night. These hours before dawn were always the strangest, suspended between yesterday and tomorrow, between darkness and light. It was 3:15 a.m. when the monitor alarm sounded from bed 5. Rebecca moved quickly but calmly toward bed 5. ICU alarms were routine. They indicated changes that needed attention, not necessarily emergencies. But as she approached Maria's bedside, she felt something shift in the air. The temperature seemed different, warmer, despite the hospital's constant climate control. And then she smelled it. Roses. The scent was unmistakable, strong and fresh, as if someone had just brought in a massive bouquet. Rebecca stopped, confused. Flowers weren't allowed in the ICU, and even if they were, where would that smell be coming from at 3 a.m. on Christmas morning? She looked around the enclosed space of bed 5. No flowers, no air freshener, nothing that could explain it. Rebecca shook her head and focused on the monitors. Maria's oxygen levels had dropped slightly. She adjusted the ventilator settings, noted the change, and prepared to increase the support. Her hands moved through the familiar motions, but her mind was distracted by that impossible scent of roses. Then she felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. You know that feeling, that awareness that prickles at the back of your neck when someone's eyes are on you. Rebecca felt it now, strongly. She turned her head slowly to the right, and her breath caught in her throat. A woman stood on the opposite side of Maria's bed. Rebecca's first rational thought was that somehow a family member had gotten past security, that someone had slipped in through a side door. But even as that thought formed, she knew it wasn't right. This woman wasn't dressed like a visitor. She wore a long blue mantle that covered her head and shoulders, flowing down over a white dress that seemed to hold its own soft light. The fabric didn't look like anything Rebecca had ever seen, not quite solid, not quite translucent, something in between. But it was the woman's face that made Rebecca forget to breathe. She was young, perhaps in her 20s, with olive skin and dark eyes that held in depth of compassion that seemed impossible. She wasn't looking at Rebecca. Her gaze was fixed on Maria, and her expression. Rebecca had no words for it. Sorrow and joy mixed together, understanding, perfect love. The woman's right hand was extended over Maria, hovering just above her chest, not touching but clearly offering something. A blessing? Protection? Rebecca couldn't tell. Time seemed to stretch. Rebecca knew she should say something, should ask who this person was and how they'd gotten in, should call security. But she couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that people don't appear in locked ICU units at 3 a.m. wearing medieval clothing. That fabric doesn't glow with its own light, that you can't feel warmth radiating from a stranger's presence like standing near a gentle fire. The woman turned then, slowly, and looked directly at Rebecca. Their eyes met, and Rebecca felt something break open inside her chest. It wasn't painful. It was like a dam cracking, like years of careful control suddenly giving way. Those dark eyes saw everything, every doubt, every loss, every patient Rebecca hadn't been able to save, every prayer she'd stopped saying, every moment of grief she'd locked away. And in seeing it all, those eyes offered something Rebecca had forgotten existed: unconditional love. The woman smiled, just slightly, and Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face without permission. Then the woman spoke, but her lips didn't move. The words came from somewhere else, from everywhere, from inside Rebecca's own heart. She is not alone. She has never been alone. Neither have you. Rebecca blinked, and the woman was gone. Simply gone. The space where she'd stood was empty, but the warmth remained, and the scent of roses was now overwhelming, filling the entire curtained area around bed 5. Rebecca's hands were shaking. She gripped the bed rail to steady herself, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over the machines. She looked down at Maria. The old woman's face was peaceful, serene. And the monitors. Rebecca's eyes widened. The oxygen saturation was rising. The heart rhythm was stabilizing. Nothing had changed in Maria's medication or ventilator settings, but her body was responding as if it had. Rebecca stood there for what might have been seconds or minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Then, training took over. She checked Maria's vitals again, carefully noting each reading, all improving. She wrote down the times, the numbers, forcing her trembling hand to form legible letters. Then she stepped back through the curtain and walked on unsteady legs to the nursing station. Her coffee sat where she'd left it, now cold. The clock read 3:22 a.m., 7 minutes, that's all it had been. Rebecca sat down heavily in her chair, her mind racing. What had she seen? Who had she seen? The rational part of her brain, the part trained in science and evidence, offered explanations. Exhaustion, stress-induced hallucination, a trick of the lighting, maybe she'd dozed off for a moment. But even as she thought these things, Rebecca knew they were lies. She knew what she'd seen, and more importantly, she knew what she'd felt. Rebecca sat at the nursing station trying to steady her breathing, trying to make sense of the impossible. The scent of roses had faded now, leaving only the usual hospital smells of disinfectant and filtered air. But the warmth remained inside her chest, that cracked open feeling, as if something that had been frozen for years was finally beginning to thaw. She looked at Maria's monitors from her station. All readings continued to improve. That shouldn't be happening. Based on Maria's condition yesterday, she should be declining, not stabilizing. Rebecca pulled up the electronic chart and began documenting the changes, each improved value a small mystery she couldn't explain. Her hands had almost stopped shaking when David Kim, the night security guard, walked past on his rounds. Rebecca's head snapped up. "David, wait!" He stopped, turning back with a friendly smile. David had worked nights at St. Catherine's for 8 years. He was thorough, reliable, and knew every corner of the hospital. "Yeah, Rebecca, everything okay?" She hesitated. How could she ask this without sounding insane? Did you see anyone come into the ICU in the last 15 minutes? Maybe through the side entrance?" David frowned. "No one's come through. I just checked all the locks on this floor 10 minutes ago. Everything's secured. Why? Someone get in?" Rebecca forced a casual tone. "No, I thought I heard something. Probably nothing." David nodded, but his expression showed concern. "You sure you're okay? You look pale." "Just tired. Long shift." "All right. I'll keep an extra eye on this wing. Let me know if you need anything." He continued his rounds, and Rebecca was alone again. She stared at her computer screen, but the words blurred. She needed to know, needed proof, because either she'd experienced something impossible or she was having some kind of breakdown. Both options terrified her, but she had to know which one it was. Rebecca stood and walked to the security office down the hall. The door was open, and Marcus Chen, the night security supervisor, was monitoring the camera feeds. "Marcus, could I ask you something?" He looked up. "Sure, Rebecca, what's up?" She stepped inside, trying to appear calm. "Could you pull up the ICU cameras from about 3:15 to 3:25, specifically the feed for bed 5? Marcus raised an eyebrow, but turned to his console. "Something happened?" "I need to check something. Patient had some monitor issues, and I want to see if I can identify what triggered them." It was a weak excuse, but Marcus didn't question it. His fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up the recorded footage. Rebecca watched over his shoulder as the timestamp appeared, 3:15 a.m. The angle showed bed 5 from above and to the side, a clear view of the entire curtained area. On screen, Rebecca saw herself approaching the bed, checking the monitors. She watched herself adjust the ventilator settings, make notes. The timestamp clicked forward. 3:17. 3:18. 3:19. Rebecca's breath caught. On the screen, she saw herself suddenly stop moving, saw herself turn her head to the right, staring at empty space. Her posture changed. She stood completely still, rigid, her eyes fixed on something beside Maria's bed. But the camera showed nothing there. Just empty space. Just Maria lying unconscious, and Rebecca standing frozen, staring at nothing. "Why'd you stop like that?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious. On screen, Rebecca remained motionless for several seconds. Then her expression changed. Her face contorted as if she might cry. Tears were visible on her cheeks. She seemed to be listening to something. Her lips moved slightly, though no sound would be recorded. 3:21 a.m. Screen. Rebecca blinked and seemed to come back to herself. She looked around, confused, then down at Maria. She checked the monitors again, her hands shaking visibly even on the grainy footage. "Rebecca." Marcus turned in his chair, looking at the real Rebecca with concern. "What was that? What were you seeing?" She couldn't answer. Her throat had closed. Because the camera proved it. There had been no one there, no woman in blue, no glowing figure, nothing but empty space and a nurse having what looked like a complete mental breakdown in the middle of her shift. Rebecca's voice came out hoarse. "I don't know. Maybe I'm more tired than I thought." Marcus studied her face. "You should take a break. Have you eaten tonight?" "No, you're right. I'll take 15 minutes." She left the security office, but instead of heading to the break room, Rebecca went to the staff bathroom. She locked the door, turned on the cold water, and splashed her face. When she looked up into the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Her eyes were red. Her face was pale. She looked like someone who'd seen a ghost or had a psychotic break, or both. The camera didn't lie. There had been no one in that room except her and Maria, which meant either she'd hallucinated the entire experience or she'd witnessed something that existed beyond what cameras could capture. Rebecca gripped the edge of the sink. She was a nurse. She dealt in facts, in measurable reality. But she also knew what she'd felt, that warmth, that love, that voice speaking directly into her heart. You couldn't measure that on a monitor. You couldn't capture it on camera, but you could feel it. And she had. Rebecca returned to the ICU at 3:45 a.m. Maria's monitors continued to show improvement, slight but steady. Oxygen saturation now at 92%, up from 86. Heart rhythm more regular. Blood pressure stabilized without increasing medication. Small changes, medically explainable as the body's natural fluctuations, but coming all at once, all in the same direction, all after that moment at 3:15 a.m. Rebecca couldn't stop thinking about the security footage, about watching herself stand frozen, staring at empty space, tears running down her face. From the outside, it looked exactly like a hallucination. A stressed nurse, working alone on Christmas Eve, finally cracking under years of accumulated grief. That's what any rational person would conclude. That's what Rebecca herself would have concluded if she'd seen another nurse behaving that way. But she knew what she'd experienced, and that knowing sat inside her chest like a small flame, impossible to extinguish no matter how much her rational mind threw doubt at it. The rest of the shift passed slowly. Rebecca made her rounds, checked her other patients, updated charts. Everything routine, everything normal. Except nothing felt normal anymore. At 5:30 a.m., as the first gray light of Christmas morning began to show through the windows, Rebecca returned to bed 5. Maria lay exactly as before, unconscious, breathing with machine assistance, but her color looked better. Her face seemed more peaceful. Rebecca stood there for a long moment, studying the old woman. The silver cross was still tangled in Maria's fingers. Rebecca reached out and gently straightened it, adjusting it so it lay properly on Maria's chest. As her fingers touched the metal, she felt that warmth again, just an echo of what she'd experienced earlier, but unmistakable. "I don't understand any of this," Rebecca whispered. No answer came. The monitors beeped steadily. The ventilator hummed. Just normal ICU sounds. But Rebecca stayed there anyway, her hand resting lightly on Maria's arm, and for the first time in 17 years, she prayed. Not the formal prayers of her childhood, just words from her heart. "If you're real, if any of this is real, help me understand. Help me know what to do with this." At 6:45 a.m., the day shift began arriving. Rebecca completed her handover, giving detailed reports on each patient. When she got to Maria, she kept her voice professional. Maria Delgado, bed 5. 81-year-old with respiratory failure. Notable improvement in vitals overnight, particularly between 3:15 and 4 a.m. Oxygen saturation increased from 86 to 93% without intervention. Heart rhythm stabilized. Blood pressure maintained with current medications. Family has been notified of grave prognosis, but should be updated on overnight improvement. Sarah Chen, the incoming nurse, reviewed the chart with a frown. "That's unusual. Any idea what triggered the improvement?" Rebecca hesitated. No clear medical explanation. Could be natural fluctuation or the antibiotics finally taking effect. Sarah nodded, accepting this. Because in medicine, sometimes things happened without clear explanations. Bodies were complex. Not everything could be measured or predicted. Rebecca gathered her things and walked to the locker room. She changed out of her scrubs slowly, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. When she stepped outside, the sun was fully up now. Boston was blanketed in fresh snow, and the air was crisp and cold. Christmas morning. Rebecca walked to her car, but before getting in, she turned and looked back at the hospital. Somewhere up on the 4th floor, Maria Delgado was fighting for her life with slightly better odds than she'd had 12 hours ago. And Rebecca had seen something, someone. She pulled out her phone. Her mother had sent a text at midnight. "Feliz Navidad, mija. I know you're working. I'm praying for you. Call me when your shift ends. Te amo." Rebecca stared at the message. Then she called. Her mother answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep but immediately alert. "Rebecca, mija, are you okay?" "Mama," Rebecca's voice cracked. "I need to tell you something. Something happened tonight." "Tell me, sweetheart. I'm listening." And there in the hospital parking lot, as Christmas morning broke over Boston, Rebecca told her mother everything. about the woman in blue, about the impossible warmth and the scent of roses, about the monitors showing improvement, about the cameras showing nothing. Her mother listened without interrupting. When Rebecca finished, there was a long silence. Then, "Your grandmother used to tell me that the Virgin Mary appears to those who need her most, not to prove anything, not to convince anyone, just to remind us that we're loved." Rebecca closed her eyes. Tears ran down her cold cheeks. "But I stopped believing, Mama. I walked away from all of it. And maybe she came to walk you back, not to the rules or the rituals, just to the love. That's all faith ever was, mija. Just love." They talked for 20 more minutes. When Rebecca finally hung up, the sun was bright on the snow, almost blinding. She got in her car and sat for a moment before starting the engine. She didn't have answers, didn't understand what had happened or why. The rational part of her mind still offered doubts, exhaustion, stress, coincidence. But underneath those doubts was something new, something she hadn't felt in years. Hope, just a small flame of it, fragile and tentative. But there. Rebecca drove home through the quiet Christmas streets. Before going to bed, she did something she hadn't done since nursing school. She knelt beside her bed, closed her eyes, and whispered into the silence, "Thank you." 2 days later, when Rebecca returned for her next shift, she checked on Maria immediately. The elderly woman had been moved out of the ICU. Rebecca found her chart. Maria Delgado had regained consciousness on December 26th. She was weak and would need extensive rehabilitation, but she was alive. She was going to survive. Rebecca stood in the hallway holding the chart, blinking back tears. Maybe it was the antibiotics finally working. Maybe it was Maria's own strength. Maybe it was coincidence. Or maybe on Christmas morning, something impossible had happened in bed 5. Something. The cameras couldn't capture because it wasn't meant to be proven. Just witnessed. Just felt. Just received. Rebecca never told anyone else about the woman in blue. What was there to say? She had no proof, no evidence, nothing but her own experience. But that experience had changed something fundamental inside her. The hardness that had built up over 17 years, the protective shell of cynicism and detachment, had cracked. And through that crack, light was coming in. She still had doubts, still asked questions, still believed in science and evidence in the measurable world. But now she also believed in something else, something larger. Something that appeared in ICU rooms at 3 a.m. on Christmas morning, wearing blue, smelling of roses, reminding broken nurses that they were loved. That was enough. Rebecca kept a small image in her locker now, nothing dramatic. Just a prayer card someone had left in the break room, showing Mary in blue. She looked at it sometimes before her shifts, and sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, when she walked past bed 5, she swore she could still catch the faintest scent of roses.